Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Marc Vinet. Born Marie Guyard in the French city of Tours in 1599, Marie of the Incarnation, also known as Marie de l'Incarnation, was a French Ursuline nun. As part of a group of sisters sent to New France to establish the Ursuline Order, Marie was crucial in the spread of Catholicism in New France as the first superior of the Ursuline in Quebec City. At the age of 32, this widowed mother of a 13-year-old boy decided to become a nun. Answering God's calling, she left in 1639 for New France to convert young native women. She was a religious author and has been credited with founding the first girls' school in the New World, as well as the Ursuline Monastery of Quebec, which has been designated one of the National Historic Sites of Canada. Her abundant correspondence is a mixture of spiritual writings and revealing accounts of life in the early years of New France. Among the zealous early missionaries in Canada was a group of Catholic militants who wanted to return to the original idealism of the Gospels. Throughout the 17th century, the Iroquois were a military power to be reckoned with. Battles in 1626 brought them victory over the Mohican and gave them control over the Hudson Valley. They invaded the territory of the Huron in the 1640s, then intensified their campaign against the settlers of New France. The Jesuits described the Iroquois fearfully. The Iroquois were masters at guerrilla warfare, striking with quick, devastating raids that kept their casualties to a minimum. The 12,000 members of the Five Nations, this number grew considerably through the practice of adopting prisoners, could summon 2,200 disciplined warriors. The little French colony on the St. Lawrence River had only 350 inhabitants. This tiny foothold was left to defend itself when the French crown refused to help. Beginning in 1643, the Iroquois attacked the outposts of Montreal, then known as Ville Marie, and Trois-Rivières, or Three Rivers, disrupting trading and agriculture. The Iroquois effectively seized control of the fur trade, blocking French access to the interior and preventing other native nations from trading with New France. From 1645, the colony was in a state of siege. Settlers no longer cleared the land. There was not a single horse in all of New France. 10% of the population had been killed in Iroquois raids, and the colony was demoralized. This bad news stemmed the already waning tide of immigration to the fledgling colony. In Quebec, Mother Marie of the Incarnation, the founder of the Ursuline convent, feared for the survival of the French presence in North America. "There are not enough forces in all the land to resist them," she wrote. "If France does not come through for us, we will, in short, either have to leave or die." Huronia, meanwhile, was devastated by disease. Influenza, measles, and smallpox brought by the Jesuits and Coureurs des Bois swept through the nation. An old Huron woman confided in Mother Marie de l'Incarnation, who had founded the Ursuline convent in Quebec in 1641. "The black robes are casting spells on us and making us die. They came into a village where everyone was doing just fine. As soon as they arrived, everyone died. They went to visit some cabins and other settlements, and it is only the places where they never set foot that have been spared death and illness. Unless they are quickly put to death, they will end up devastating the country, so that neither young nor old will live there any longer." During these years, France was not interested in helping its North American colony. It was engaged in European wars and bitterly divided within by a series of civil wars in which the nobility rose in rebellion against the absolute monarchy. Guerrilla warfare in New France continued sporadically for the next 15 years. The colonists sent an emissary to France to plead their case before a new king. This new king understood that a military presence would be necessary to deter the Iroquois. Newly crowned, this young monarch already dreamed of creating a great empire, and he did not want to inaugurate his reign by losing his colony in the New World. He realized that New France would never prosper as long as it was treated as a purely commercial operation. Changes were made. The colony would now report directly to him and the royal administration through a governor and an intendant. Things would finally improve and change in New France under the energetic reign of King Louis XIV of France, the monarch that helped usher in the golden age of New France. The most menacing cloud that hung on the horizon of New France was the scourge of the Iroquois, and their attacks were growing violent and numerous. The Iroquois had at this time about 2,000 warriors divided among 5 tribes. The Mohawks, furthest to the east and nearest to New France, were the fiercest warriors. The Senecas, further to the west, were the most numerous. The other 3 tribes lay in the center. The tribes often made war and peace separately, but in times of crisis usually acted together, and this gave them a great advantage over neighbors who never seemed able to unite their forces effectively. The Iroquois were democratic in some ways, being led, for example, by chiefs who owed their positions solely to their skill and courage in battle, their eloquence and dignity. Their attacks showed a daring, cunning, and determination which surpassed anything among their neighbors. In parties of 10 to 100 or more, they hovered around the French settlements or lay in ambush along the waterways, waiting to surprise the heavily laden canoes which passed to and from Quebec with furs and supplies. The Iroquois, who are all perpetual and irreconcilable enemies of the colony, read a royal memorandum, have, through the massacre of a great number of Frenchmen and by the inhumanities they commit against those who fall in their clutches, prevented the country from being more populated than it is at present. The king, in order to provide an appropriate remedy, has resolved to wage war onto their very households, so that they may be entirely exterminated. King Louis sent experienced troops who had just returned from a victorious campaign against the Ottoman Turks. On the 17th and 19th of June 1665, 2 vessels arrived in Quebec, the Jesuit superior wrote, with 4 companies of the Carignan-Salière regiment. On the 30th of the same month, 2 ships were spotted in the distance, which filled us with great joy. There is no way to express the delight of the entire people. Along with the soldiers came the first representatives of the crown. During this extraordinary summer, Quebec, a town of 70 houses, saw its population double. Marie de l'Incarnation believed that the colony and her convent were saved. All the vessels have arrived and have brought us the rest of the army with the most distinguished persons that the king has sent to save the country, she wrote. They had all believed they would perish in storms during the crossing. They were made to understand that this is a holy war, in which the glory of God and the salvation of souls is at stake. The regiment still had not engaged in battle, but the colony felt triumphant. There is something wonderful at work in this whole business, wrote Marie de l'Incarnation, because if the Iroquois had stood their ground, they would have created a lot of trouble. But this defeat has inflicted on them the worst possible humiliation. Their country has been laid waste. It is too late in the season to rebuild. What little grain survived the burning of the harvest will not be enough to feed them. In 1666, the Iroquois, who were suffering an epidemic of smallpox, did not starve, but they had their first glimpse of the new military strength of the French. The chiefs of the 5 nations decided to sign a peace treaty rather than fight them. The Iroquois Confederacy continued to hinder the thrust of Europeans into the West, but it was not about to destroy New France the way it had destroyed Huronia. The 1,200 men of the Carignan-Salière regiment were freely enlisted men who had signed on for 3 years. Some of the most experienced officers had refused to come to America for fear that their careers would suffer if they were too far from the eyes of the court. but newer recruits hoped to use the posting as a route to promotion. In 1666, the soldiers were getting ready to return to France, but Louis XIV decided otherwise. The expedition against the Iroquois having been completed, the king desires that the soldiers of the Carignan regiment remain in the country, offering each of them the means to set himself up and even to help him procure some cleared land. Seigneuries were offered to the officers. Under the feudal regime, the seigneur received income from the tenant farmers inhabiting his lands, ground their grain at his mill, and subjected them to various duties. The soldiers were offered both land and money. 350 soldiers declined the royal offer and returned to France, but 400 members of the expedition decided to remain in the colony. The soldiers who were supposed to have exterminated the Iroquois to the last man, but had actually not killed anyone, became the forefathers of an entire nation. Some of them became good settlers, as the king had hoped, but others, after their initial taste of adventure, headed back into the forest to pursue the fur trade. In New France, the biggest obstacle to building a prosperous colony was an acute lack of women. The arrival of so many soldiers meant that the population was 2/3 male. A royal program to supply women was initiated, and the filles du roi, or the king's daughters, arrived by the hundreds. In 1665, a vessel had arrived in Quebec bearing a much greater surprise for the inhabitants than mere soldiers. "The 100 girls whom the king sent this year have just arrived," wrote Marie de l'Incarnation in October 1665, "and almost all of them are already provided for. He will send another 200 next year, and corresponding numbers in future years. He is also sending men to be married, to say nothing of those who make up the army. It is astonishing to see how the country grows and multiplies. Over 7 years, the royal government sent more than 1,000 young women to New France, mostly from the Paris region and the Diocese of Rouen. Many were paupers, with no future in France. The king provided them with a dowry ranging from 50 to 300 pounds, or French livres. There are all kinds of girls," Marie de l'Incarnation wrote, "some of them very coarse and hard to manage. Some others, being of good birth, are more honest and will prove more satisfying to the king." What the new country offered was hope of advancement, though it took time. Marie de l'Incarnation wrote on October 29, 1665, "There are many poor people here, and the reason is that when a family creates a household, it takes 2 or 3 years before they have enough to eat, not to mention enough clothing, furniture, and a whole range of little things needed for the upkeep of a household. But once these hardships are behind them, they start to feel more comfortable, and if they conduct themselves well, then they become rich over time, as much as a new country like this will allow." On April 30th, 1672, at the age of 72 years, after a long illness, Marie of the Incarnation died in Quebec. Before dying, she had one last message for the son she had abandoned in France more than 30 years earlier. To her great satisfaction, he had become a Benedictine monk, and he regularly corresponded with her. "Tell him that I always kept him with me in my heart." Upon her death, she was revered as a saint, and today she is considered one of the Church's greatest mystics. Because of her works, the Catholic Church declared her a saint in 2014, and the Anglican Church of Canada celebrates her with a feast day. She died in Quebec without ever seeing her native country again. I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.